Those three individuals, they overlap in time, but I want to make sure that people understand that Monet is older, he came first. They overlap in time, and each of them is concerned, Monet more towards the end of his life, with internal experience. So I think that Bergson helps us understand how Monet comes to discover and then struggle to express his personal experience of being submerged in the world around him, and to try to create an experience for his viewer. And then Proust, I see as a parallel example to Monet, but of course in a very different medium, in the way that Proust submerges you in his prose. He drags things out. He goes back and forth between reality and memory. And to return to Monet, I would say that in his late paintings, especially if you read the reactions to them in their time, they become more evocative than literally descriptive. And so I see a parallel there with Proust. And I think that in Proust's prose, there are technical aspects of the prose. The fact that his sentences are very, very long, and he uses punctuation to connect phrases so that he doesn't really allow you to stop. And in that sense, or he makes you want to stop, you run out of breath. You know, it's a kind of immersive experience in both imagery and in, if you will, the technique of writing that I think in some sense has a parallel with Monet. And it took me a while. I had heard that Proust is sometimes called an impressionist writer. And of course these parallels, people tend to scoff at them. But I think maybe there is a kind of truth to seeing Proust as an impressionist writer, as long as the impressionism that we're talking about is Monet in his late years, not the impressionism of the early 1870s, which brings up the problem also of impressionism as a term, the question of terminology. I think maybe you could say that impressionism is anything that Monet happened to be doing at a certain time, because the name stuck with him, even though in the early 1900s, he's probably much closer to other painters than he is to the Impressionists that he exhibited with in the 1870s and early 1880s. Bergson understood the limits of painting. He said there are two kinds of knowledge. There's the scientific, analytical kind of knowledge where you know things by measuring them, analyzing them, that sort of thing. But he said that that kind of knowledge fails to account for the inner being, the essence of an object. He's talking about objects, walls, whatever, anything, physical. How do you understand their essence? For him, it's a second form of knowledge which comes through intuition. And I will argue that, that Bergson is discovering this at a time that Monet has been experiencing it and struggling to express this inner being or these internal feelings that he has, which he himself will later say derive from intuition. So, you know, I hope that explains how these three names are related. I think they are fundamental. And I think that you see the potential for it in his early works, And the series are a culmination of his feeling and then eventually his desire to convey the feeling of being immersed in nature, of being surrounded by nature. In my talk, I intend to start out with the idea of plein air. In French, the word suggests being surrounded by air. The air is something full. It's an environment. And if you read Monet's letters, even his early letters, he talks about his love of being surrounded by what he loves. It has been very often said, even by some recent scholars, that Impressionism is an optical art, an art for the eye. And I argue that Impressionism, especially as we come to understand it through Monet, is an art that addresses the body's sense of embodiment and of being in a world, in a space. And to try to make the long story short, when Monet begins groups of paintings, he's shifting viewpoints, as if one painting cannot convey full knowledge of a place. He moves around, so part of my title is Displacement. Eventually, he will start making series. Now, it's true that, of course, it's a very smart move commercially, but it corresponds. I don't think Monet would do things that are not authentic. And it corresponds to his experience, and so he can do something that is commercially viable while maintaining authenticity. And so as he develops first groups and then series which are more closely related, he is, I believe, trying to convey this experience of immersion, and eventually, as the brushwork begins vibrating and begins dematerializing and becomes more and more abstract, I think he is struggling to convey something that is more of an internal experience. And this is where he begins struggling with the limits of painting. So actually, I added a second title to my paper. I call it Monet and the Limits of Painting. And to get back to Bergson, Bergson very well understood the limits of a single image, the limits of a single image's ability to convey an authentic knowledge of a place. And of course, this is where place comes in. And I think that we see Monet beginning to expand the dimensions and to experiment with different formats, vertical formats. The human stands vertically. It's true that the eyes are placed side by side, and so very often the landscape format is horizontal. But we find Monet experiencing, stimulated certainly by Japanese examples, with vertical formats and size as well, so that the body as a whole becomes the target, so to speak, of the artwork. And he expands height by width with very wide as well as tall canvases. And he will, in some cases, put canvases together in two wide canvases, diptychs or triptychs. And then finally, ultimately, the Orangerie, where he realizes, he fulfills his desire to completely surround and to completely immerse, as well as, of course, to make a political memorial for the end of World War I. I mean, but that is not an aspect that I'm dealing with in this particular paper. although I do in the book that my paper is related to. The series, to conclude, is the culmination of, I think, this desire to express the feeling of being immersed in nature, to express a truth of nature, of how one experiences a place by being bodily in the place rather than an outside spectator. I say, for example, that Monet's vision of nature is circumambient rather than, how shall I put it? Oh, yes, rather than fenestral, by which I mean it's not as if he's looking at it through a window, and he doesn't use the one-point perspective system that for so many generations was the basis of a kind of window-like looking onto nature. So I see the series as this progressive development of, you might say, authenticity and subjectivity in Monet's work.